So Mike, when we do de-identification and we can use user ID then at scale, even though it'll be anonymized, will that solve a lot of those problems?
I think I would ask Dave and Nicole that actually, because I mean, I can present to the engineers and experiment in any way that, you know, we can dream of. It's whether or not it then becomes possible to build. I think building, yes, sounds like it, and Phil would be able to speak to that, but then it's like the analysis side. Is it feasible? Is it possible at all? And if it is it like easy enough to do where it's not going to take a month to get an analysis on something?
So the de-anonymization of the user ID would be helpful if we could join it back to our other data sets. But it sounds like if we are going to anonymize the user ID, we're still kind of with that problem where we're stuck in this one data set. And if there are any changes at all that are made to this data set without our knowledge, like changing positioning of something in the JSON array or changing naming conventions, we still doesn't exactly solve the problem, I think. Yeah, because as of right now, our analysis is limited to essentially only snowplow data. And all of those events are written out by the growth engineers. So I'm trying to think through if.
I'm just trying to ask the question here, like Nicole, before we try to not use a user ID because we don't have formal consent or kind of agreement with the community. But I know Justin and Keenan, they are trying to push for SaaS. We collect anonymized user ID. And we collect user ID, we anonymize them so that we can link one person's behavior across like different pages or features. With that, if that's the case, I would imagine that should include experimentation as one use case in there, right, Justin? So that the reason I'm asking is I think if that's the case, the challenge we face in experimentation might be smaller because we don't have to solve for that.
I was going to ask Nicole Nicole, you said even with that, you have to join across other data, and sometimes that data can change. Can you be specific and on an example of what data that is and what changes?
Sure. So like one of the issues that we came across with the blank project experiment was so we had recorded data up until like March 12th, and then the data suddenly completely disappeared. And we were wondering, oh, where is all of this data? What happened? And then it turns out there was something changed in the positioning of the array. So instead of it being a 0 position, it became a 1 position. Yeah. And because of that, and it wasn't communicated to us as a team, so we were just like, oh, where is this data? Eventually figured it out, but we would like to not have to implement those workarounds as frequently in the experiments, because the moment that there is a change, suddenly all the data that is collected after is not caught by the code.
Right.
So we have an issue. We have an issue for that, and it is of course solvable. What it means is that the growth teams need to be able to control whereabouts in Snowplow we're inserting that data. It just means if there's a change, what currently happened is there was a change with the GitLab standard context in Snowplow, which bumped something ahead of all of ours, which would have meant that all the queries and sysends had to change to allow for that. And that's not optimal, and we don't want that moving forward. So we can solve for that. Do we need to just add an item into this high-level roadmap, I guess, under data collection?
Yeah, I think so.
Cool.
Have you considered, Phil, like defining a schema for that data collection up front, and then that schema is versioned or matches whatever is used on the analysis side? Is that part of what you're doing?
Yeah, so there is the standard schema, which we've been piggybacking off. There is also an experiment schema. So we probably just need to formalize that, decide how that gets pulled from SAS right through to sysens, where it's even stored in sysens. It's just looking at that end-to-end process and actually just carving out a path that will not change.
Yeah, very cool. So, Nicole, are there other examples of that sort of thing happening that throws roadblocks in your way for analysis?
Yeah, I think the past couple of roadblocks that we've come across is, I think they're mostly growing pains, if that makes sense. The GEM framework is a relatively new framework that we're using, and they pay companies, like other companies pay other companies thousands of dollars to get this work done for them. So the fact that we're keeping it in-house is like a big task to undertake. So I feel like a lot of the other issues that we've come across isn't necessarily like a problem with like the schema or anything like that. It's just like better communication between the teams, like more, I guess, just like more QA upfront from both the engineers and the analyst side, just so that we can catch problems before they go into production.
Yeah, one thing, Nicole, one thing I want to ask you as well. For example, with the old framework, we have an experiment table. All experiment data automatically captured there. But for this new framework, we don't have that. Is that something solvable, or like what ideally, how, like if Justin and Phil have engineer resources, ideally how this should work? That's like the question.
So ideally, the reason for the experiment table is to show who in the experiment entered into the treatment or the control. Now, the missing piece that we had between the experiments table and the snowplow table is we're using, like, a lot of our experiments right now are running based on feature testing. And feature testing we can't like run feature testing without looking at what the user's behavior is in the actual like experiment itself. Like, are they actually clicking on whichever button? Are they actually viewing the page? So the experiments table gives us a list of the people who are in the experiment, but because we don't have a way to tie our events data back to our experiments table, that's where kind of the gap is. So we can't tie it to like specific projects, we can't tie it to specific namespaces, and understandably, like, we need to have consent from our users to be able to do that. But at the same time, we're kind of stuck in this high level analysis of, we're looking at the entire universe of just people who took these actions. We're not sure if we're hitting the right treatment or control. We're not sure if, are the people who are seeing it, are they supposed to be able to see it, or is it like a weird experience for them? So that's kind of where we're falling short. And I'm not.
You need the exposure condition.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. So in an ideal world, we would be able to link everything, all of the events, back to specific users, so that also historically we can look at, are these users performing better because they are engaging more with, GitLab as a product? As of right now, we kind of just have like that high level, conversion metrics. We have like high level number of namespaces, how many events they're taking in. But other than that, like the snowplow data is kind of where our gold mine is. Once we are able to track like which users are performing which events, we can suddenly narrow down like which field of like, oh my God, this is a highly engaged user. How do we mimic this across the entirety of our audience? But at least that's my experience from doing experimentation from a previous company.
And all of the work that you just said, Nicole, like it sounds like today I've heard this, like it takes you a lot of effort to put together analysis of one thing. I would expect that if we meet our goal, which like up in the document, like our high level goal, I think, right, Hila, is like 4 experiments per engineer per month or something like that, right? If we increased the velocity of engineers delivering experiments to 4, hearing what you're saying, like you probably can't keep up with the analysis of that many more experiments, right? So I think another okay, so you're shaking your head yes, or confirming my assumption. I think another requirement here is that everything you said needs to happen automatically, or as little amount of manual configuration from your perspective as possible. So your job then becomes, instead of wiring up the analysis, it's sort of set up for you, and then you're doing a deeper level analysis around did it work? Let's do one click deeper. Like the PM has a question, you're going to go like find the next layer of answers to that question, instead of like, here's the data and I finally got it working after 3 weeks of effort, right?
Yeah, Justin, and just to reiterate, everything that Nicole's brought up so far is still valid, but kind of like what she was saying, it's we've been learning the hard way a lot of these times, but it's been a lot of these processes are speeding up, but at the beginning you were saying it's taking us a while to analyze these experiments, but really it was taking a lot of time just to understand, were we looking at the right data?
Right.
So once again, everything Nicole's brought up so far, there's definitely room for improvement, but I think we're just coming off of learning the hardest way possible for a couple experiments in a row. And we're starting to see kind of a decrease in the amount of time to validating that we're looking at the right thing.
But I get sorry, go ahead, Hila.
Yeah, so I think like my observation, I'm not that deep in the process, but comparing to previous experience, my observation is we have some basic framework to like split the traffic and show them different experience. Where we really fall short is we don't have an easy way to QA, whether it's the variant or the events, the metrics, right? Like for like we probably can build something to do that. I don't know, but or set up a process. Like we don't have that step, and it's probably not as easy. Like I remember using Optimizely, I can just open the staging app and switch between version A, version B, go to experiment C and see switching between version A, version B, and I see is okay or it's not okay. I can manually trigger a convert button and see whether the right data show up or not. Like we don't really have that yet. I don't know whether it's something we can establish with current framework. That's one thing.
To that, Hila, we do have an issue. It's a stretch issue for this milestone in on an adoption to allow you to enroll a specific segment into an experiment experience. So you can say a control or candidate, but where it doesn't, I think, solve the problem is how long it takes data to flow through the systems to make. So let's say you enabled me in production today. I go and do some actions. We can't actually see if the data flowed correctly for like 24 hours.
Yes.
So that's the biggest challenge there. But in terms of like a PM or a QA person ultimately doing a test of it to make sure it's functioning as expected, we should be able to have that ability fairly soon, in the next couple milestones, let's say.
That's a really good point. And that reminds me of like, if our data infrastructure is keeping having outage like this past one, right? We haven't been seeing any data in the past 10 days for the old experiments, live experiments. Then do we need to bypass that? Do we need to establish our own system to capture experiment data? Otherwise, like we cannot get anything. So that's another thing that Mike reminded me.
Yeah, and if the goal is one experiment, essentially a week per engineer, like that needs to be a lot faster and easier to do. We can't have a day or two delay to verify that it was done correctly.
Yeah.
We have enough traffic where you should be able to see within an hour whether or not you're like tanking something, like a key metric, right?
Yeah.
I mean, what we typically do is we'll see if the staging data is flowing, but that still takes a while. And then we enable in production and then check it again. So you gotta like keep doing these checks to make sure it still looks okay. And then sometimes the data just is gone at that point. And then it's like, oh, something went wrong there.
Is it right? I heard, so all of your experiments that the growth team runs uses snowplow events. Is that correct? Or do you also use usage ping events?
We do not typically do any self-managed experimentation because of just the round trip. And like we're shipping some stuff in 13.11, but it's going to take a while for that to even have any volume because people will take a while to upgrade and those things.
So ostensibly, whether it's bypass or whatever, you should be able to get snowplow events into some analysis tool or setup that you have.
Yeah.
Quickly.
Do we also, Nicole or Dave, I know we have backend events as well, like actual sign up, actual conversion. Are those snowplow as well? Or those are from some other sources?
They're recorded in like the same table as the snowplow like front end events. I'm not sure if they're recorded by snowplow though. I would assume that they are, but we would want to check with product intelligence if that's the case.
Because some of those events come from like the data, the replicated tables in production, like new account created, right? Like that's data I can go find that's replicated. But if you're using that data, then right now that data is not even flowing, but it's usually fairly delayed. So yeah, that'd be a good like click in to see what's going on there.
Does Snowplow not have a method for us to like check real-time data? I'm just wondering because a lot of the other like event capturing companies like Amplitude, they normally have like a UI in which you can see the data flow in real time. Is that something that we have for Snowplow or no?
Well, so I don't, technology wise, there's no reason why you couldn't. Snowplow, we don't like log it. It doesn't send the data to Snowplow. We're simply using like the front end libraries that collect events and then send it to our Snowflake data warehouse, not Snowplow, but Snowflake data warehouse. So what I think there's some thread here to pull that's like, how do we analyze Snowplow events in real time? Like that's sort of the high level question. Because right now it's about as real time as like any other event that gets loaded into the Snowflake data warehouse, which is not very real time. There's no technology reason why we can't hook into the events that Snowplow is sending to GitLab servers and do something with that data. But I think there's something there to figure out.
Yeah, I think the best thing we have right now is the little Chrome add-on extension, the Poplin data, I think it is, that lets you get like fairly confident, but it's still ultimately not in the tool that we do the analysis in. So it's like still crossing our fingers that everything ends up where it needs to be. And it's not the easiest thing to traverse through those events and understand them. Like there's usually like 2 or 3 separate events for a click with a page load, and some of it's structured, some of it's unstructured. So I never feel super confident that even when I think I'm seeing what I should be seeing, that I am not going to be surprised, the next day when it gets this high sense.
Yeah.
And then I think the QA is one thing, and we uncover the data piece with that as well. And then the other thing is, I think the biggest gap is, like to Nicole's point, is in the analysis part, which is a couple of things. If we can get user ID tracking, maybe we don't need to build a framework without user ID tracking. So that's a question maybe Justin, you can help clarify, right? So because that might change the direction we're pursuing. And also how we can, ideally how it should work is we track limited number of metrics for one experiment, but with some user ID, we can easily analyze a set of other metrics. So for example, I launched an experiment. I thought this conversion is most important. I look at the result, it's same. But now I think of, maybe I should look at the step before. And I should be easily maybe use Amplitude or run a query to get the step before, even though I don't have it. Currently, we don't have that at all. Like we are only confined to the set of metrics. Even that set of metrics takes a long time to find out which are they, where are they correct. Don't even mention whether we can do a broader analysis after fact.
And for that, we'd want to have user ID, namespace ID combo, just because there can be, a user with multiple namespaces as well.
Right, that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a good call out though, Hila. At least with the gem, the way it is like you have to upfront know everything you'd want to track. And I mean, anyone who's done experimentation, I think, has had the moment where they see the data after it's running, be like, oh, now I have 3 other questions that I want to know what happened here and there and there. And that's just not possible right now. So unless, I think this is part of the learning process with the framework, is like, oh, we didn't think to include that the first time. So now the next time, let's think to include that. And then it's like rounds of that. But then the experiments themselves take multiple rounds of kind of development and iteration to ultimately get to a point where we're like, yeah, this is the data we needed and we're confident in it.
So
I just want to call out that that's not related to the new framework. That's whether we're pseudo-anonymizing user ID.
Okay.
we can remove that from the framework if we don't need to. If we want to track user ID, we can track user ID.
So
from a technology point of view.
Thanks, Phil.
Okay, clarifying question for me. Help me understand. So, because that light bulb just went off. Today, an engineer has to intentionally instrument every single thing you want to track in a given experiment when you build it, because you don't use user ID. So then that's how you do your A/B analysis and comparison. If you were to use user ID, then now you can look at any snowplow event tied to user ID and sort of ostensibly answer the questions like Keela asked, like, what did they do before? Did this affect some other downstream event? Is that
Right.
a fair summary?
I think in theory, yes. I haven't seen our team being able to do that, even using the old framework as well. I don't know, Mike, do you know?
Well, I think the issue with the old framework is it was just saying this user ID has this experiment. So for the things where we have a user ID and actions, we can say that they were in the experiment. I think the issue is we don't track user ID
across the experiment.
Like if you were to throw like heap on your tool or segment where it's just tracking everything and tying it all back to a user, we don't have that. And so that's where it's like, oh, we see, 25% of people are falling off here. I wonder what they're doing. We can't answer that question. We just know that they fell off.
I think aside from whether or not the sort of de-identified user ID project that's in flight will fix this problem or not, I think that's a requirement that we should capture. Like we must be able to do this, no matter how.
We haven't been able to do this with the old framework or the new framework, because we have to dance around this user ID, ultimate user ID tracking. Feels like the old framework is only confined in the experiment. The user ID is only confined in the experiment. The new framework, we try to not track user ID at all. We try to use namespace ID and some other things.
Right.
Yeah, and to the goal of being velocity of experiments, I think this is one of the big things that's holding us back, because it takes more iterations on any single experiment, but it also makes it harder to get the learnings that you get from experiments that generate the other experiment ideas. Like, oh, we just try tweaking this one little thing here. Maybe that will capture those people that fell off, or whatever it is. It's very hard to have those kind of serendipitous moments of like the light bulb going off, where you can see the data and be like, oh yeah, there's something here. It's just, I don't see that happening with our experiments as much as I'm used to in the past with others.
Yeah, in an ideal state, everything in terms of experimentation, like the events that we're tracking will be standardized, and then we'll just write out a query, and then we can just swap out like what events we're tracking and just spit out like a high level analysis and then deep dive from there. Like that's ideally how we would want experimentation to work, so that the velocity of having engineers pump out 4 experiments a week would make sense.
I think another thing that we'll want to add to the list that we have is the metrics dictionary work for snowplow events. So we're doing metrics dictionary for usage ping events right now, but we also need type of thing for snowplow.
Yeah, I was thinking about that when you showed the usage ping metrics dictionary. I was like, that'd be so nice if we had that for snowplow.
Well, I mean, we don't even have it. Yeah, so but I think if that would help you tremendously, and then the change frequency, or the mechanism in which other PMs and other engineering teams change those events there can be a process in which you get notified, or a different deployment cadence or something like that, right? For snowplow events, that makes it so that you don't get surprised like mid-experiment run if a PM decides to change a metric or add a bunch of metrics or something.
Yeah, and something along kind of snowplow event auditing as well. I know Mike experienced that. He thought this is tracked. He thought the tracking is done that way, but when he actually see the data is completely wrong. Nobody has been using a lot of the events for a long time. So.
Yeah, it wasn't unique. It was capturing like 5 different events.
It's probably worthwhile too I've done this before, where there's some subset of events that are tracked that like require a more stringent change process. So they're really well defined and well scoped, and usually they're tied to like, you're going to report this number to Wall Street or something. And so not everyone can sort of just make an arbitrary change. You sort of have to go through some code owners or some approval flow. So there's something there to consider, like types of snowplow events, so that you're not getting surprised.
Yeah, Justin and Phil, I think we're over. Oh yeah, are we over?
I can go long, but yeah, we are over.
Okay, yeah, that's great. So I think based on the conversation, one thought I have is, do you feel like with this business case, you need engineer, but you almost need, I don't know whether it's data engineer or a data person who can help, because build an automate dashboard, maybe using Python or R to automate the data extraction analysis, so that like analysts like Dave and Nicole, they don't need to do the repeating work. I don't know. It feels, yeah.
I think you need both. Phil, I want you to hear your input here. My assumption is that you need engineers to work like, so you're not using growth engineering capacity to go iterate on the segmentation, like the actual bucketing tools and segmentation tools. Then I think you probably, like you said, Hila, I think you need some data engineers on Rob Parker's team, or several of them, to go and solve problems like, why can't we get snowplow events in real time? Why do we have to spend a bunch of effort building like tables and models for reporting, like that sort of stuff? What do you think, Phil?
Yeah, I think we can summarize a lot of our problems with the time it takes to get experiments from design through development into production and actually see the data and then iterate on that. We're spending a lot of time, development time, data analyst time, refining that and then pushing out changes. So if we can reduce that time, it's going to make it a lot easier all around. Hila, you had a growth coffee and learn with a friend of yours whose name I forget, Kevin, perhaps.
Very close.
Right. Who was a data scientist, and I think maybe that's a role that we need, or actually dedicate some time to to get that data in the right format and get it into a place where our analysts can view it a lot faster and consistently.
Yeah, I think probably the data engineer piece, the data piece is critical. And also, Justin, like I think the anonymized user ID is a critical kind of component or dependency as well, right? That almost can decide the direction. Do we still trying to dance around that, develop something that we can use that like without that, or we can get that in the near term, and then the thinking will be completely different as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a couple months or 3 months or 4 months away still, but even throughout this conversation, it doesn't sound like it's the one, like the long pull or the one thing that will solve a lot of these problems. Like it's certainly a dependency, you're right. I think we need to do even more once that's done. Certainly accelerate it if we can, but once that's done, then there's more work to be done to get us to the point where we're happy.
But we should be assuming that's happening. So we shouldn't for example, do we keep investing in the current GIM framework, or like, I guess we have to, because we still need to rely on them, but we almost should cap the investment on those, trying to have in mind the future is coming, the future with user ID is near.
Yeah, I think that's the right way to think of it.
Okay.
Can I just call out here that there's a huge difference in the types of experiments we're asked to run. We have experiments tied to the current growth KPIs. They're hard to do. The KPI is so far away from the user experience. That trial conversion is a great example. Inviting new users to groups is another example. It doesn't happen in one click, or it doesn't happen in one user interaction. If our goal is to move faster, then we can do these MVC experiments. They're sort of painted door experiments, or maybe just taking it one step further. I don't like we haven't built this functionality yet sort of messaging. We can do those experiments a lot faster. They're a lot quicker to develop. The data requirements aren't so hard to review. But they don't necessarily impact on the KPIs that you're trying to influence, Hila and Mike. Short term, while we're waiting for a decision on user ID, maybe we focus more on those sorts of experiments.
Yeah,
I think that's fair, Phil. I mean, I think that's what we've done in adoption with some of these, like changing, like putting buttons on pages that go to existing pages, or changing the, project to repo. But even those, with some of the back and forth and changes, that I mean, that label change took like a month. So I think we're getting better. I think we can do more frequently. I think we need to be tighter and choose smaller ones, but I think we're still taking longer than it needs to.
Yep, fair point. Yep.
But a requirement I hear though is that even for experiments that are not, or the results you want are not as close to the user experience, you're still able to measure efficiently the impact on those things. So if it's trial conversion and you change the trial sign up form, that you can actually see down the road, does that customer convert to a paid user because I changed the trial? Like, you want to be able to answer those questions without a ton of effort, right?
Yeah, I think ideally we want to measure the close by clicks and page views to whatever the change is, and then the actual conversion event, trial signed up, right? And ultimately, ideally, retention of that customer as well. That's the dream analysis we want to do.
I've ran A/B tests that have taken a year to run before, because you want to do cohort analysis that runs over the lifetime of a customer account.
Yeah.
So you want to be able to do that, right? Like, you want to be able to say, oh, remember this experiment we ran? Well, it turns out it increased conversion by X, right?
Yeah.
Or retention by X or whatever.
Yeah, I think the goal is to be able to follow along on a user's journey, like one user. What has their lifespan with GitLab look like? Then we will be able to answer like a lot of questions to Hila's point about retention, how to improve, like how do we get more people into the door? How do we get more people as paid users? But yeah.
Okay.
Cool. So Justin, do you have any other questions or thoughts or anything else we can help?
I don't think so. So I think next steps, Hila, right, would be to synthesize this and sort of reframe. I still think the request, or sort of the business case and the request for resources, look similar, but I think there's an insight here of, we need data team support, data scientists, whatever it is, right? In addition to adding engineering resources to build out functionality. So I think we should write that up and we can put that in this somewhere.
Yeah. Do you want to take
there's one other piece missing there. What about product support? We haven't talked about who, it's not clear in that business case, at least, who the DRI would be from a product perspective if we're going down that path.
We should probably have one, huh, Phil? Yeah, okay, that's good feedback. I think, yeah, we've all been part-timing it in some capacity, right?
Yeah.
That's not very efficient.
Yeah, I think it's either, I'm just thinking loud, like either there might be a new person, or this is pretty close to product intelligence. But I know Keenan is busy, like product intelligence has a ton. Just from, this seems to be close in terms of the work. But on the other hand, the growth PMs are the customer, growth PMs are experiencing and paying. So they can definitely share a lot of ideally how this should work. So I think it's either a new person or probably something like that.
Yeah, it's definitely close to Keenan's world. But yeah, Keenan, I mean, well, he's focused on things that are dependencies to this improvement.
Yes.
And de-identification. But I don't know, channeling past experience at other companies, I've had dedicated PMs responsible for these platforms. And a lot of it too is like coordinating, which I think is the hard thing at GitLab. This is not isolated to one engineering team.
Yes.
And so a lot of the hard work is actually coordinating with like Rob Parker's team.
Exactly.
And then the rest of the product, and then growth, right? So you could make a pretty strong argument that that's like a full-time job.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, I agree. There's something there, and maybe it's a phased approach too, where we say, hey, to get going, based on what we know today, here's the sort of framing of this in the request. Down the road, I think we need dedicated PM and 3 more, whatever, right? Efficiently. So that may be one way we frame it.
Yeah, and I like that. I think a phased approach makes sense. And currently, growth engineer, like we have growth engineer dedicate some time working on this. So I feel like an easy place to start is just formalize that so that we have one engineer, and then we don't have to juggle between engineer this and the experiments itself. And then there will be an ideal phase where this need to move to.
Yep, that makes sense.
Cool.
I can update the doc with sort of what we talked about here and frame that in that way. What else do you need to finish this business case?
I think that's the main thing. Like I can like review all the comments on the benefit piece and just update those, remove all the comments. And once you have the ask piece, then it'll be ready.
Okay.
More ready. Yeah.
Cool. I'll do that tomorrow, and then Phil, I'll tag you in to review it, get your feedback on it, and then we can unblock it.
Awesome. Thank you so much for everyone's time.
Cool. Thanks,
Justin.
Yeah.
Bye.